close proximity to the Jewish Theological Seminary. And it was a little confusing to me because my experience when I went to the center piece, the central organization of the conservative movement, it felt very different than the expression of Judaism I had grown up with. It felt much more halachic and much more restricted and a little more guilt-ridden, I think, than I had experienced. So that was kind of confusing. And as I was getting ready to graduate, the year before I was at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I was on a long 3-day hike. We hiked from the Sea of Galilee to maybe we hiked from the Mediterranean to the Sea of Galilee, Yam it was called. And so I was hiking with a friend of mine. It was a great guy. I got to meet people from other places. And a friend of mine who had grown up in Philadelphia. And we were starting to talk about what we thought we would want to do when we graduated from college. And I said, I'm thinking maybe about possibly becoming a rabbi. And I'll tell you, this was 1988. I had never met a woman rabbi. I mean, I grew up in the conservative movement, and they'd only started ordaining women rabbis 5 years before. And I knew there were some reform rabbis. I'd never heard of Reconstructionism at all. And he said, we talked about it. He said, well, why might you not? And I said, well, I'm not certain that JTS is really the right fit for me. And I talked about why. And he said, you really sound like a Reconstructionist. And I said, well, what's that? And he gave me this not inaccurate, but very partial definition of what Reconstructionism is. He said, Reconstructionists believe that Judaism is the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people, and that American Jews live in two civilizations, the American civilization and the Jewish civilization. And so they do things, this is the one example he gave me, they do things like they create a Jewish ceremony for Thanksgiving. And I said to him, and that's true, actually, that was all he said, and I said, that is the strangest thing I've ever heard, and that doesn't sound like me at all. Which is a story I told the interview committee when I was applying for the restaurant. So flash forward to, that was 88. I started in rabbinical school in 1993. I mean, I discerned that I did want to be a rabbi, and I learned a lot more about Reconstructionism, and I learned a lot more about RSC, and I was really clear that if I was going to go to rabbinical school, RSC was really the only place for me. And that was what I felt called to it, and I think I was really right about that, but I had never visited a Reconstructionist synagogue. And at that point in time, RSI started in the beginning of its 25th year, and there were a number of us who had never been to a Reconstructionist synagogue. A number of us who had stories very similar to mine, coming up from the left wing of the conservative Judaism and realizing that their home was really in the Reconstructionist movement. So that felt, in fact, I started with 19 students, and only one of them grew up in a Reconstructionist synagogue. And now it's completely different, but that was the case 25 years ago, 26 years ago. So that fall, I was like, that's something I really wanted to remedy. That just didn't seem so right to me, and I felt like I should start to visit as many Reconstructionist synagogues as I could. And that fall, my friend, who was I met him through the Haskalah movement, the National Haskalah Summer Institute a couple of years earlier, who was a senior, so didn't yet have rabbi in front of his name, Steve Nathan, he's married to someone at that time, so it's a slightly different last name, said, my student pulpit is in Allentown. It's only about an hour away. My student pulpit is at Haskalah for any of you first-year students who want to visit a Reconstructionist synagogue. You're welcome to drive up with me. I'm doing services next Friday night. So I and a handful of maybe 2 other people said, yeah, we'd love to come along. So I'm here to tell you that my very first visit to my very first Reconstructionist synagogue was to Haskalah. I do not remember, I think it was a church though. I do not remember where. It was in like the social hall, right? And so he led a service. The service was pretty familiar. We did not yet have the prayer book. The prayer book, Shabbat Chagim, came out the next fall, so I don't remember. Different prayer book. Yeah. Maybe it was from the experimental version. There was an experimental Friday night version of Kol Neshama. And what I remember more than anything was the Torah discussion. I had no idea what to talk about. But I was, first of all, in the conservative synagogue, there was never a discussion. The rabbi got up, and the rabbi preached, the rabbi spoke. So some of it was just the conversation, and then the calendar of the conversation conversation, the intellectual, the rigor, the curiosity, the ownership. So this community, you imprinted on me what a Reconstructionist community is. So yes, I'm so excited to talk about what is Reconstructionism even, and it's going to be a discussion because you embody what is Reconstructionism. So we have, the last year we created two really photo-rich, as long-standing Reconstructionist community, Reconstructionists love words. We talk a lot of our stuff is very long, maybe too long, and it goes all the way back to Mordecai Kaplan, and it's a tradition I carry on, for better and for worse. So we created this last year a couple of booklets that are trying to be very terse and very tight, very succinct in our words, and very full of photos, because one of the things that I say, it depends on who's asking me what is Reconstructionism and what their orientation is. If they're asking from a very intellectual perspective, I might give them that definition that my friend Art gave me all those years ago, that Reconstructionists believe that Judaism is the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people, and then unpack each of those words. So we might want to do that tonight. But a lot of times what I say is the best possible, and even it's my job to explicate, to articulate what is Reconstructionism, but the best possible way to really understand it is through the demonstration. The best possible way is to have people to come in, to be a part of your community, whether it's during prayer or Torah study or discussion or your work in the community. That, I think, is the best possible way to really understand Reconstructionism. So this is full of photos, hopefully to try to evoke some of that. And what I thought we would do is, there's one thing, I think we have enough for everybody, is kind of just use the booklet as a text to unpack what is Reconstructionism. I'm starting just with one of them. The other one that I'll hand out at the end is one that just tries to explain the 501c3 that I have for Reconstructing Judaism, this organization. The organization I work, it's the largest concentration of people working on nurturing and cultivating a Reconstructionist approach, but it's the central organization for a much larger movement of nearly 100 congregations around the world, and a lot of passionate people who don't necessarily belong to the movement through congregations, but they have their own connections. So that one's a little bit more organizationally focused. So where I'd like to start is maybe let's just read through the very brief booklet up to the page. We don't have to reconnect with us. And then we'll go back and we'll have a conversation about what it says in here. Starting with the first page, we'll do the popcorn style. We'll read through. I think you're sort of reading.
We approach Judaism and life with deep reverence for the past and a passion to relate it to the present.
Just turn over.
In a rapidly changing world, Reconstructionist communities share and create new ways of being Jewish to connect us to the divine and ensure our lives are filled with purpose.
We view Judaism as the evolving civilization of the Jewish people and an ongoing relationship with God.
Our shared culture, rituals, traditions, and practices reflect over 2,000 years of that evolution, and we take hold of it and shape it to this day.
We break down walls that divide us, demonstrating what it means to be Jewish today, and standing up for justice and creating a better world for all.
We have originated many of the core innovations within American Judaism and lead efforts to make our community even more forward-thinking, inclusive, and relevant.
We experience and discover God through our daily acts of ritual, creative expression, and encounters with humanity, all of which can lead to individual spiritual fulfillment.
This is the
We are committed to democratic practice in Jewish life. We believe that people hold the right and obligation to reconstruct Judaism in order for it to remain relevant in our lives.
Okay, so that is, so when people say to me, what is Reconstructionism today? This is one way that I answer it in this book. So my first question for you is, does this resonate with you? Does this feel like it's discussing Haskalah?
Hi, excuse me. I have a question that has been burning my brain for several years, which there's a statement on your website, which I really have difficulty understanding. I believe it says, the past has a vote, but it does not have a veto. And it's very difficult for me to kind of wrap my hands around it, because I do study Torah, and I also look at your archives and your Gemara Torah pieces, and wonder, of course the past doesn't have a veto, because it no longer exists.
So that quote comes from Mordecai Kaplan himself, the founding thinker of Reconstructionist Judaism.
No wonder he was asked it and they burned books.
And I think the first time he said ancient authorities have a vote but not a veto. And I think that really especially raises up the commitment to democracy. And when I go to that definition of Judaism as the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people, and I unpack it for people, I start with the people at the end. I start with the focus on the Jewish people, that the one continuous thing throughout Jewish history, throughout Jewish existence, is the Jewish people. That the civilization, the rich civilization that we have built up over 3,000 years of existence has changed. It's been influenced by internal development. It's been affected by external things that have happened to us, but it's the Jewish people that has continued. So if you take that the commitment is of the Jewish people and our vibrant engagement with the civilization that we're creating, so there's that commitment to evolution, to change. So that comment comes from people who are saying, we cannot introduce changes because either halakha says we can't do it, or the ancient rabbis say we can't do it. How can we, mere humans, we stand on the shoulders of giants, how can we, mere humans, introduce change? And what Kaplan felt like was that, as you said, that the past exists in our memories. That past exists in the way we study and in the way we cherish it. But whether it is a source of inspiration and a source of energy and generativity for the future, or whether it is a set of chains that stop us from changing, that's our decision. So Kaplan's teaching and Reconstructionist communities to this day resonate very deeply with it, is to say we want to look at what our teachers taught us, what our forebears taught us. We want to learn from it and draw deeply, but we don't want to be constrained by it. There was with a very strong social justice commitment. The pressing issue of Mordecai Kaplan Day, and we can translate it to our own day in any way that we wanted, had to do with the status of women, especially chained women, especially agunot. Kaplan did a lot of his writing in the years between the two world wars, and as terribly decimated as the Jewish community was in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, we were really, the European Jewish community was extremely disrupted in World War I as well. Both the European Jewish community, where many people were killed, there were pogroms, there was displacement, and also there were Jewish soldiers who went to fight and who didn't come back. And there was this terrible situation of many, many Jewish women whose husbands, and there's also issues of abandonment that we read a lot of the stories about immigrants that a lot of times men would come to America with the intention of bringing their family later, and they wouldn't actually ever fetch them. So there was a fairly significant proportion of women who did not know where their husbands were, and who, so they weren't known to be dead, but they were absent. So that in that kind of, so these women were alone, and especially in that day, to be alone meant they were often very marginalized and very precarious. They could not remarry because they could not either. It couldn't be clear that either their husbands were dead, or the husbands couldn't be identified to give them a divorce, because in traditional Jewish law, only a man can initiate a divorce. And every rabbi who subscribed, now this is still in the headlines, this was like, there was the headlines in Israel last week about a woman in this situation. So this remains true. Every rabbi who subscribed to halakhic procedures said, we know that the situation of avunot, we know that the situation of chained women is a huge problem, and we know, but this is how the halakha prescribes it, and we can't do anything about it. And so that's what he was saying, that the tradition, the halakha, the ancient authorities, they had a veto. That everybody saw that this was a situation that was unjust, and there were people who were suffering, and people in authorities would say, we see that there's a problem and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, we also know throughout Jewish history that this has happened before, and that sometimes the community would find ways to act. Like Moses Maimonides, a great teacher, basically said, okay, we're not going to allow women to initiate divorce, although there is some evidence that maybe that happened around the year 1000. But what he said is the rabbis can put pressure onto the men, even going so far as to go to their household and threaten violence to deliver the divorce. And so they were neither willing to change the halakha to allow women to initiate the divorce, nor to apply social pressure. And here, because the men wasn't, for the most part, they weren't talking about recalcitrant men, they were talking about absent men, probably dead men, they weren't willing to take any kind of action. And Kaplan basically said, he was part of a group who said, at this point, halakha has broken down. It is no longer a medium of repair. And that social justice actually has to trump tradition here. There has to be some pathway forward. His pathway then was to say, if the civil authorities grant a divorce or a recognition that the man is dead, then the religious authorities should recognize that as well, and the woman should be free to marry. So that he was saying, we can't, if we're not going to be willing to change halakha, we can't use halakha, we have to find a different pathway. And in the 70s, after the first graduates of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, they created the first ever egalitarian divorce ritual. So that empowered a woman to either serve a divorce on her husband, or you don't actually have to have both parties there to effect a divorce religiously, for a woman to set up a ritual in motion where she could claim that she was divorced and then marry again. So that's where it comes from, the idea that we want to be deeply engaged with the tradition. We want to draw from it as rich storehouse, as resource. But if there are things that can either be what the rabbis did in the 1970s was reconstruct it, then we are empowered to reconstruct it. Because what we were finding is that the people were saying, and we're seeing it in Israel right now with marriage, that the rabbinut, the chief rabbinate, is being so recalcitrant around marriages and divorces that huge numbers of Israelis are just opting out, and they're going to Cyprus to get married. They're not doing religious marriages at all. So that's an example of. So that means that there's that the religion it's either the religious expression is either broken or irrelevant. And the Reconstructionist approach says we want to honor the past, and we want to make certain that what is most lively about it is relevant and meaningful to us in this day, and what will be meaning. We want to both make meaning for our children and empower our children to do that reconstruction as well. So reading through this booklet, does it resonate with you as an expression of your congregation? Josh, I see you nodding. I don't want to put you on the spot.
Well, this congregation was very, very welcoming to me and to my partner. And I would say radical inclusivity and hospitality is not what I associate with American Judaism, as much as they would like to say they are.
Yeah, the gap between rhetoric and.
Right, and that includes the reform movement. So that, to me, it's one of several of the aspects that's reflected in here that is carried out.
I think that's right, that when Kaplan put forward the idea of Judaism as a civilization, it was fairly radical. And this was in the mid-1930s. And part of what he was trying to do, there were people at that time who said, this is the way you have to be Jewish. They had very strong opinions. This is the way you have to be Jewish. Sometimes it was, at that moment in time, the reform movement said that Judaism was only a religion. And then if you had any other expression of Judaism, within that there was a deep concern about Zionism. You said that you were any kind of cultural or ethnic or national expressions of Judaism, that wasn't really Jewish. And you had Orthodox authorities who said if you were not a halakhic Jew, if you're not fully observant. And what Kaplan and his circle were trying to do was to say there are many, many, many different ways to be Jewish. You can be passionate about Jewish literature, and if that is your main engagement, or Jewish dance, or you can be solely a political Zionist who never, or a secularist who never goes to synagogue, or for you it's about being an activist out in the world and doing social justice from a Jewish perspective. And the Reconstructionist approach was to say yes, and yes, and yes, and yes. And it was about broadening the boundaries of participation without lowering the standards. And so the earliest commitments significantly had to do with recognizing full equality for women. The movement was founded with, grew out of more commitment to democracy. And the first Reconstruction Synagogue, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, was founded in 1922, right after women were given the suffrage, given the vote, and so it was founded with full religious equality for women, and so it started with inclusion for women. There has been since the 60s an understanding that there is space for that a decision for a Jew to partner with a non-Jew does not mean it's a decision for that Jew to leave the Jewish community. And that if we welcome those families into our communities, that the community would be enriched, and usually the family would be enriched. And that is more and more and more normative, but was quite radical in the 60s. And then that carried over to full inclusion of LGBT, well, at the beginning, gay and lesbian, and then I think a little bit later, the bisexual came in, and then more recently trans, embracing trans folks. So I think, and I think right now a real commitment within the Reconstructionist movement is working on making space for people of color and making certain that they feel welcome as well. And I think that sometimes people say to me, like, how come we're not bigger? And I think there's different kinds of big that I aspire to. The one big I really aspire to is bigger recognition of our influence, bigger recognition of our impact, bigger coverage and awareness about us. I don't necessarily aspire to bigger congregations or a much bigger movement. In my experience, in my observation, and I have the great blessing to travel around to Reconstructionist communities around North America, a lot of people, they drive by other synagogues to come to Reconstructionist synagogues. It's a choice, and it's a choice where it's an activist approach. It's a hands-on approach. You make the food, you lead the service. We make the food, we lead the service. We show up for each other. It's not the kind of community where you drop your kids off at the door and keep going. In some of our bigger congregations, they have requirements where, if you're a part of if you join this community, you sign up to come to services at least once a month. That they have a full program, Friday night and Saturday morning services. You make a commitment to show up not just on the high holidays, but through the year. One of our big communities outside of Washington has a really wonderful communal lunch every Shabbos. And if you join their synagogue, it comes with the expectation that you will one time a year cook for that communal lunch, and another time a year clean up from that communal lunch. I remember Obama was still in the White House when I started in the presidency, and the Jewish liaison in the Obama White House was a member of that congregation. And the first time I met him, he was wearing an apron and rubber gloves because he was on cleanup duty. So he was a man who talked to the President of the United States every day, but he was scrubbing pots in the kitchen at this synagogue. So, and it's really clear to me that not everybody wants that kind of deep involvement, but that is, I think, really part of our strength, and the quality of the people who are attracted to a Reconstructionist approach. And I think as a rule, we believe me, we fail sometimes, but we try really hard to be warm and welcoming and to be open, I think, to being changed by the people who come to us, that it's not just a join us and become like us, but join us and offer your gifts so that we can be enriched by those gifts.
Something that draws me into Reconstructionist Judaism that I think is something that draws a lot of people in is the idea of kind of what Arthur Haskalah calls God wrestling. That we can be intellectual and curious, and there's no monolithic viewpoint, even on the issues that other Jews might say there's a monolithic viewpoint on. That we can have a diversity of thought within our communities, and that we can be we can challenge each other to think through our beliefs and discuss them. I actually remember the first year I was part of the congregation, it was right after Israel and Lebanon had a 2007 conflict. And Malkavina had the focus of Yom Kippur that year was a congregational conversation about Israel and Lebanon. And I was in college a couple blocks away, and the Hillel there would not have any conversation if you didn't monolithically support one view. There was no discussion. And here I was in synagogue on Yom Kippur, where we were broken into partners, and we could think through our viewpoints. And I'd never seen that before.
I brought some materials that I hope you'll pick up afterwards. I mean, I'll hand out the other booklet, and in them is is a sheet about one of our projects that I think is incredibly expressive of what Reconstructionism is, and it speaks exactly to that point. It's called Evolve: Groundbreaking Jewish Conversations. A commitment to diversity is at the core of a Reconstructionist approach. Diversity of people, diversity of ideas. And I think, and so the Reconstructionist movement helped to help the Jewish community formulate and embody a commitment to pluralism, a commitment to multiple viewpoints, multiple ways of being Jewish. But we see too often now that pluralism has kind of broken down into a kind of a balkanization. And so rather than a rich conversation, a rich and a brave conversation across difference, it is just, I'm going to scream at you. I'm going to express my own viewpoint as loudly and as vociferously as I possibly can. And I'm going to listen to you, not to be transformed, but so that I can rebut whatever it is you're saying, or shutting down, especially around Israel-Palestine, a real shutting down, because we see that in a lot of synagogues across the American Jewish community, including, I'm sad to say, in some Reconstruction synagogues, because that discourse is so broken that so often it turns into wrestling. And I think you're right, that part of what, now this is not exclusively Reconstructionist at all. Think back to the long-standing Jewish tradition of preserving the minority opinion. The rabbis of the Talmud, it was really important for them to hear and to capture all voices. And when you look at a page of Talmud, you'll have conversations across the generations, like there's the central text in the middle, and that is, well, this rabbi says, and that rabbi says, and the majority goes here, but the minority is here, and then around it are commentators from the next several hundred years, all engaged in conversation. And I think Reconstructionism really tries to embody that multi-vocal, multi-perspective sensibility